The summer sun burned brightly over the quiet suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets, and every driveway gleamed with polished cars. It was the kind of Saturday people looked forward to all week, warm, breezy, and filled with the smell of blooming flowers. For me, it was the perfect day to fire up the grill, invite some family and friends, and enjoy a backyard barbecue that would mark the start of the season. The preparations had been meticulous. I had marinated ribs overnight, stacked fresh briquettes by the grill, and chilled drinks in ice buckets that clinked every time someone reached inside. The backyard was alive with laughter and chatter, as kids darted around with water balloons, dogs chased frisbees, and the grown-ups lounged in folding chairs, sipping cold sodas. The sizzling sound of burgers hitting the grill was matched only by the mouth-watering aroma that rose into the air, drifting lazily over the fence line into the surrounding yards. But in every neighborhood, there's always one person who sees joy as an intrusion, one neighbor who thrives not on community spirit, but on control. Ours was a woman known to everyone, though never fondly. Karen. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, the kind of person who peered through blinds at all hours, eager to report violations, real or imagined. Whether it was grass growing an inch too high, cars parked slightly off-center, or a recycling bin put out a day early, Karen never missed an opportunity to enforce her own brand of order. As the smoke from the grill curled upward, it drifted inevitably toward Karen's yard. I hadn't thought much of it at first, after all. Who could possibly object to the smell of fresh barbecue on a sunny day? But Karen was not who. She was different. She thrived on complaints, and for her, this wasn't the smell of grilled meat. It was an offense, an attack, a declaration of war. At first, it was subtle. A door slam here, a window shutting there. I caught a glimpse of her pacing in her backyard, arms crossed, glaring toward the source of her misery. Still, I brushed it off. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And this was my property. Everyone else seemed to enjoy the gathering. But as the minutes stretched on, Karen's agitation only seemed to grow. Her face reddened every time the wind carried another wave of savory smoke her way, and her gestures grew more animated, as though she were debating whether to march over immediately or wait for her fury to boil over completely. By the time the steaks were ready, the tension had reached an almost comic level. Guests noticed her too, whispering under their breath, pointing discreetly at her yard. The kids laughed, not fully understanding the danger of living next to someone so volatile. To them, it was like watching a cartoon villain stew in their own anger. To the adults, it was a reminder of how fragile peace could be when one neighbor chose bitterness over coexistence. Then, without warning, Karen disappeared into her house. The door slammed so loudly, it startled the dog and silenced the conversation for a brief moment. Everyone looked at one another, uncertain of what that meant. I told myself she was probably just retreating to escape the smell and noise, and with a shrug, I carried on serving plates of food. But, deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Karen never let anything slide. If there was a line she could cross to make her displeasure known, she would cross it. The laughter and enjoyment resumed, but a shadow of unease lingered in the air. It wasn't long before I found out what she was up to. Less than 30 minutes later, I noticed flashing lights reflecting faintly off the windows of my house. At first, I thought maybe something had happened elsewhere on the street. But when 2 police cruisers pulled up directly in front of my driveway, the truth became clear. Karen had escalated. The kids froze mid-play, their laughter cut short as they spotted the officers stepping out of their cars. Conversations hushed. Drinks were set down, and everyone looked at me with a mix of confusion and sympathy. I felt my stomach tighten, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I knew exactly who was behind this. Karen had actually called the cops on a backyard barbecue. And as I watched the officers walk toward my yard, radios clipped to their shoulders and notepads ready, I realized this wasn't just about food or smoke anymore. This was about power. Karen wanted to prove she could control what happened in her neighborhood, and she had just brought the law into what should have been a day of joy. But what she didn't expect was how quickly things would turn against her. The sound of boots crunching on the gravel path silenced the backyard completely. Every guest's eyes shifted to the approaching officers, who walked with steady, measured steps toward the gate. The sizzle of meat on the grill felt deafening in the quiet, and the smoke that had seemed so welcoming a moment ago now rose like evidence against me. My heart pounded, not out of guilt, but out of dread for what was coming. The officers, 2 men in uniform, carried the calm professionalism of those who had been summoned to countless domestic disputes before. Their expressions were neutral, neither hostile nor friendly, but their very presence carried authority. The children clung to their parents, and one of the dogs whimpered nervously, as though sensing the tension. As they entered the yard, the entire gathering shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay or scatter. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, drawn to the flashing lights. Some whispered to one another, already spinning the story of what must have happened. For them, drama had arrived in the middle of a lazy afternoon, and they were eager to watch. But the truth was simple. Karen had called the police on a barbecue. The officers glanced around, taking in the scene, the plates of food, the drinks, the families gathered in laughter. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing hinted at crime. If anything, it looked like a neighborhood celebration, not a disturbance. Yet the police were here because someone had insisted they intervene. Then, like a predator revealing itself, Karen appeared. She stormed across her lawn, marching with righteous fury, her phone still clutched in her hand, as if it were a weapon. Her voice carried before she even reached the fence, sharp and shrill, accusing and dramatic. To her, this was her victory moment. Her chance to humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. The officers listened, their faces composed, but the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. She spoke of smoke invading her home, of noise disrupting her peace, of rules being broken. She framed the gathering not as a barbecue, but as a public nuisance, a deliberate attack against her comfort. To hear her speak, one might think we were hosting a riot rather than cooking hamburgers. Yet even as she rattled on, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The smoke was nothing more than the normal byproduct of a grill. The noise was the laughter of children, and the so-called disturbance was a little more than people enjoying themselves on private property. Still, Karen clung to her performance, her voice rising higher, her gestures growing wilder, desperate to convince the officers that this was a matter of law and order. The guests shifted uncomfortably, embarrassed for her, though some struggled to hide their smirks. Everyone knew Karen's reputation. Everyone had felt the sting of her complaints at some point. Whether it was lawn decorations, parking, or even the wrong type of mailbox, she had built a history of inserting herself into other people's lives. This, however, was a new low, and the neighborhood knew it. 2 officers, maintaining composure, eventually turned their attention back to me. They asked their questions, calmly and professionally. Was there excessive noise? Was alcohol involved? Were there any disturbances beyond what they could see? Their tone was measured, but beneath it all, there was a faint trace of disbelief because what they were seeing simply didn't match the complaint they had received. As the conversation unfolded, the smell of barbecue wafted through the air, undeniable and tempting. The officers glanced at the grill, where ribs and burgers crackled over the flames, juices dripping onto the coals. Their professional demeanor held, but their eyes betrayed them. They weren't immune to the aroma filling the yard, an aroma that seemed less like evidence of guilt and more like an invitation. Meanwhile, Karen hovered like a hawk, demanding action. She insisted they shut us down, that citations be issued, that consequences fall swiftly and severely. She spoke as though she were the one in charge, as though the police were her personal Yet with every word she spoke, her desperation became clearer, her credibility weaker. It was in that moment, as I stood there waiting for judgment, that the tide began to turn. The officers weren't seeing a criminal or a public menace. They were seeing a family enjoying a meal, a group of friends sharing laughter, a neighborhood gathering that harmed no one. And the more Karen pushed, the more unreasonable she looked. The guests began to relax, sensing the shift. The children resumed their play, cautiously at first, then, with growing confidence. The adults picked up their drinks again, watching the unfolding scene with interest. Even the dog wagged its tail, as if it too could sense the balance of power changing. But what happened next would be the moment Karen never expected. One of the officers, his voice steady but carrying the faintest trace of amusement, asked about the food, not in an official capacity, not as evidence, but as a human being who couldn't ignore the smell any longer. His words broke the tension, like glass shattering. The guests chuckled, and the second officer smirked despite himself. Karen's face contorted in outrage. But it was too late. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as her attempt to humiliate me in front of everyone was slowly transforming into her own undoing. And as the officers lingered, curiosity mixing with hunger, the stage was set for the ultimate reversal. The officer's casual remark about the food sent a ripple of laughter through the backyard, soft at first, then growing bolder as the guests realized the tension had shifted. The grip of fear, the uncertainty of having police standing in the yard, began to loosen. People exchanged knowing glances, some whispering to one another, while Karen stood rigid, her expression frozen in a mask of disbelief. To her, this was supposed to be her moment of triumph. She had expected flashing lights and stern orders, citations written, and her neighbors humiliated. But instead, the sight unfolding before her was something entirely different. The officers weren't treating this like a crime scene. They were treating it like what it was, a backyard barbecue on a warm Saturday afternoon. The air hung heavy with the smell of ribs, chicken wings, and burgers. Smoke curled lazily upward, mingling with the laughter that had cautiously resumed among the guests. The officers, still professional, couldn't completely mask their curiosity as their eyes flicked toward the grill. The crackle of fat dripping onto hot coals seemed almost to call out to them, and the plates stacked with buns and condiments told the story of a feast in progress. Karen's voice cut through the scene like nails on a chalkboard. She demanded action, her words frantic now, tinged with desperation. She accused the officers of ignoring her rights, of failing to protect her from what she described as toxic smoke and noise. She gestured wildly toward the grill as though pointing to evidence of a crime. Her voice grew shriller, the pitch rising with every sentence, until even the neighborhood onlookers who had begun to gather discreetly near their own fences could hear her tirade. But every word worked against her. Instead of reinforcing her claims, her hysteria only highlighted how absurd the situation truly was. The officers remained composed, but their body language told the story. They weren't reacting with urgency or concern. They were watching her unravel. Then came the moment that sealed Karen's fate. One of the officers, his tone calm, but carrying just enough authority to silence the crowd, explained that nothing unlawful was taking place. The barbecue wasn't breaking any ordinances. The noise level was reasonable. The gathering was peaceful, and no one appeared intoxicated or disorderly. In short, there was nothing for them to intervene in. The words hit Karen like a hammer. Her mouth opened to protest, but the declaration left her momentarily stunned, her argument crumbling in the face of official confirmation. The guests, meanwhile, exhaled in relief. The children resumed their games. The adults picked up their plates again, and laughter returned in cautious waves. What had been a looming confrontation now felt like a celebration of victory. But the officers weren't done. Perhaps recognizing the absurdity of the call, or perhaps swayed by the atmosphere of community that hung in the air, they lingered longer than expected. Their stance softened, their questions grew less formal, and before long they were making small talk with the guests. One of them even cracked a smile as he pointed to the grill, joking about how they had shown up at the right time. That was the moment the impossible happened. An invitation was extended. Whether it was meant as a light-hearted offer or a genuine one, the officers didn't decline, and in doing so, they turned Karen's attempt at control into a public spectacle of humiliation. The very people she had summoned to punish her neighbors were now enjoying themselves alongside them. The guests cheered at the turn of events, rallying together in a spirit of camaraderie that made the afternoon even more lively. Plates were filled, cups were raised, and the officers, still in uniform but now relaxed, became part of the gathering. The neighborhood had witnessed a rare reversal, authority siding, not with the complainer, but with the community. For Karen, it was unbearable. Her face, red with rage and embarrassment, twisted as she realized the scene slipping away from her. She had lost control. Her threats, her shrill protests, her endless demands, all of it had collapsed under the weight of common sense and simple humanity. She stood at the edge of her lawn, sputtering, her voice drowned out by the laughter and the sound of tongs clinking against the grill. It was more than just a defeat. It was exposure. The very people she had sought to impress with her supposed authority now saw her for what she was. A bitter, joyless neighbor consumed by her need to dominate. And, in their eyes, she wasn't powerful. She was ridiculous. The more she shouted, the less anyone listened. The officers ignored her protests, the guests laughed louder, and even the onlookers from nearby houses began to smirk. The harder Karen tried to reclaim control, the more powerless she became. At one point, she stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard that the sound reverberated down the street. The guests cheered again, raising their cups in mock celebration of her retreat. For a while, peace seemed restored. But everyone knew Karen well enough to understand that this wasn't the end. She was humiliated, and humiliation fueled her like nothing else. As the barbecue continued, the mood grew festive. Neighbors who had never spoken much before mingled freely, united by the absurdity of what they had witnessed. The officers eventually departed, but not before thanking everyone for the hospitality and making it clear that no laws had been broken. Their departure cemented the victory. Yet even in the joy of that afternoon, a shadow lingered. Karen had been defeated. Yes. But she wasn't the type to give up easily. Her pride had been wounded, and her reputation had taken a public hit. For someone like her, that wasn't just a setback, it was a declaration of war. As the sun dipped lower and the last plates were cleared, I couldn't shake the thought that she would be back, angrier than ever, looking for another way to assert control. The neighborhood had laughed at her, the police had dismissed her, and I had stood unscathed through it all. But Karen wasn't finished, and deep down I knew the real battle was just beginning. The following week should have been calm. After all, the barbecue had ended in laughter. The officers had left satisfied, and the neighbors had gone home with full stomachs and stories to tell. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe Karen would accept her defeat and retreat into silence. But with Karen, silence was never the end. Was only the pause before her next move. Her revenge began quietly. On Monday morning, I found a folded notice tucked into my mailbox, written not on official HOA stationery, but scrawled in Karen's unmistakable handwriting. It was a list of supposed violations she had witnessed during the barbecue trash left visible for too long. Noise levels exceeding reasonable enjoyment, and even a note about the smell of grilled meat as a form of air pollution. At T-bottom, she had signed her name with a flourish, as if she were the arbiter of law in the neighborhood. I laughed at first, crumpling the note into a ball and tossing it into the recycling bin, but I underestimated her persistence. The next morning, another note appeared. Then, another. By midweek, I was receiving them daily, each one longer and more hostile than the last. She accused me of weaponizing food to irritate her, of orchestrating gatherings solely to disturb her peace. The absurdity of the claims was laughable, yet her determination was unsettling. By Friday, her tactics escalated. A letter arrived, not handwritten this time, but typed, printed, and slipped under my door. It carried the heading "Formal Complaint," as though she were filing charges in some imaginary court. She threatened to contact city officials, environmental agencies, even health inspectors if I continued my campaign of harassment. The neighbors whispered about her obsession, some amused, others wary, but all agreed. Karen was unraveling. Her obsession didn't stop at letters. Soon she began patrolling the street with her phone in hand, recording videos of my property as though she were gathering evidence for a crime. She zoomed in on the grill, the lawn, even my recycling bins. On more than one occasion, I caught her crouching near my fence line, muttering to herself while filming the yard. Guests who visited noticed her too, whispering in disbelief as they watched her behavior grow stranger by the day. But Karen wasn't just targeting me. She had turned her sights on anyone who had attended the barbecue. She left angry notes on their doors, accusing team of aiding and abetting a disturbance. She filed noise complaints against homes that had remained quiet, simply because their owners had laughed at her during her humiliation. It was as if she had declared war on the entire block, determined to claw back the control she felt slipping through her fingers. The neighborhood, however, didn't bow to her. Instead, they grew closer. Families who had rarely spoken before now swapped stories of Karen's antics. A quiet sense of solidarity formed, a collective resistance to her tyranny. Where once people had tried to appease her or ignore her, now they stood united in their shared frustration. Still, her tactics grew bolder. One afternoon, I came home to find bright orange cones placed across my driveway, blocking my car from entering. Attached to one was a note claiming my vehicular activity violated community standards. Another time, she dumped a bag of charcoal ash at the edge of my lawn, claiming it was evidence of environmental harm. Every action she took was more desperate, more unintended, and more public. Neighbors began to capture her behavior on their phones. Videos of her shouting in the street, pointing aggressively at houses, and patrolling with her phone like a self-declared enforcer began circulating quietly among the community. Some shared them in private group chats, others joked about uploading them online. Karen had wanted to control the narrative, but instead, she was becoming the neighborhood clown. Then came the night she crossed a line. Around midnight, I awoke to the sound of rattling outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when I peered outside, I saw her shadow crouched near my grill, phone light flickering as she tried to photograph it in the dark. My anger surged, but more than that, a chill ran through me. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. This was intrusion. The next morning, I installed security cameras around the yard. I wasn't the only one. Other neighbors, tired of her late-night prowling, began setting up cameras too. Within days, the block was dotted with blinking red lights and mounted devices, each one a silent guardian against her obsession. Karen, of course, noticed, and when she did, her behavior grew even more erratic. She stood in the street screaming about illegal surveillance, accusing us all of spying on her. She claimed the cameras were targeted at her windows, though in reality, they pointed squarely at our own properties. The irony was lost on her, but not on anyone else. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was building towards something bigger. The notes, the videos, the driveway cones, they were all leading up to a grander strike, something designed to reclaim her power in dramatic fashion. And sure enough, that moment came the following weekend. It was Saturday again, another warm afternoon, and the smell of barbecue once more drifted into the air. This time, it wasn't mine, but a neighbor's. Inspired by the camaraderie of the previous week, others had decided to host their own cookouts, thumbing their noses at Karen's crusade. The laughter and joy spread down the street, a ripple of defiance she couldn't contain. Karen erupted. She stormed into the center of the street, waving her phone, screaming into it as she dialed number after number. She called the HOA president, City Hall, even emergency services, claiming there was a mass disturbance on her block. Neighbors filmed from their porches as she shouted wildly, her voice carrying across the cul-de-sac, echoing her desperation. And when the flashing lights appeared again, the neighborhood held its breath. Would this be a repeat of last week, or had Karen finally gone too far? The flashing lights washed over the cul-de-sac for the second time in as many weeks, painting the quiet suburban street in red and blue. But unlike the first time, there was no uncertainty now. The neighbors didn't scatter or shrink back into their homes. Instead, they leaned on fences, stood in driveways, and pulled out phones to record what they knew would become another spectacle. Karen, standing in the middle of the street, like a general at war, waved frantically at the arriving police cars. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, her voice shrill as she shouted accusations into the air. To her, this was the moment of redemption. She had been humiliated once, but this time she would not be ignored. This time, she would prove to everyone that she could not be defeated. The officers stepped out, familiar faces from the week before. Their posture was calm, though the faintest trace of wariness flickered across their expressions. They had dealt with Karen once already, and now here they were again, summoned to handle what she described as a mass disturbance. But as they scanned the scene, their eyes met nothing resembling chaos. Instead, what they saw was a neighborhood alive with laughter. Families gathered in backyards, grills sizzling, children running with sparklers as evening crept in. The air smelled of food, smoke, and summer joy. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't a disturbance. It was unity. And at the center of it all, Karen looked utterly out of place, the lone figure railing against happiness. Her voice rose as she explained her version of events. She claimed the neighborhood had conspired against her, that the block parties were targeted harassment, that the smoke was poisoning her home. She pointed wildly from yard to yard, naming families, accusing them of crimes that existed only in her imagination. The neighbors, standing together, shook their heads in disbelief. Some chuckled openly, others simply filmed, capturing every word of her meltdown. The officers listened, their professionalism intact, but it was clear their patience was wearing thin. They had been dragged out here again, not for crime or violence, but for a grudge. Karen, however, didn't see it. She believed she was the hero of the story, and she doubled down on every accusation, her words more desperate with every passing minute. Then, the moment of collapse arrived. One of the officers, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority, explained what everyone already knew. There was no disturbance. There was no violation. There was no crime. What Karen was witnessing were families enjoying their Saturday evening, perfectly within their rights. The declaration hit her like a hammer. The crowd of neighbors erupted in whispers. Tin laughter. Phones captured every second as the officer reminded her of their previous visit, emphasizing that calls like these wasted time and resources. His tone wasn't just professional, it carried an unmistakable edge of frustration. Karen's face twisted in outrage. She tried to argue back, her voice rising to a scream, but the damage was done. The officers weren't siding with her. The neighborhood wasn't siding with her. She was alone, flailing in a storm of her own making. The more she shouted, the more foolish she looked. And then, as if fate itself wanted to underline her defeat, one of the officers chuckled quietly as the smell of grilled ribs drifted by. He joked lightly, too lightly for Karen's liking that. Maybe they should have come hungry. The crowd burst into laughter, not cruel, but uncontainable. The timing, the memory of the previous week, the sheer absurdity of it all, it was too much to resist. Karen's humiliation was complete. She screamed at the laughter, demanding respect, demanding action, demanding anything that would restore her crumbling authority. But no one gave it. The officers stood firm. The neighbors laughed openly, and Karen's power evaporated into the warm night air. Finally, one of the officers turned to her with a final warning. Frivolous calls like these, he explained, could carry consequences. False reports wasted resources that could have been needed elsewhere. If she continued, she risked not only embarrassment but legal trouble. The words landed heavily, silencing even her shrill protests for a moment. She had called them to destroy me and my neighbors, but, instead, she was the one standing on the edge of consequence. The neighborhood erupted in cheers the moment the officers walked away. They didn't issue citations, didn't shut down the cookouts, didn't punish anyone. Instead, they left with handshakes, smiles, and even a plate of food wrapped in foil. And in their absence, the party only grew stronger. Music played, laughter echoed, and neighbors who had once kept to themselves now mingled freely, united in defiance of the woman who had tried to control them. Karen, meanwhile, her face red, her words incoherent, she stormed back into her house and slammed the door so hard it rattled the windows. The sound was met not with fear, but with cheers. The neighborhood knew they had won. For the first time in years, Karen's power had been broken not just by one person, but by the collective strength of a community that refused to bend. Yet even in her defeat, unease lingered. Everyone knew Karen wasn't finished. She had been warned, humiliated, and ridiculed, but she was still a neighbor. She still lived among them, still carried the bitterness that had fueled her for so long. To fear wasn't of what she had done, but of what she might try next. That night, as the block party continued into the early hours, a quiet understanding settled in. Karen's downfall had been public, spectacular, and unforgettable. But her story wasn't over. For people like her, humiliation didn't end the fight, it only deepened the obsession. And deep down I knew the final confrontation was still ahead. The weeks after Karen's public downfall felt like a new era for the neighborhood. What had once been a quiet collection of strangers was now a community bound together by shared laughter, shared meals, and shared defiance. Cookouts became a weekly ritual. Children played freely in yards, Neighbors who had never spoken before now waved warmly at each other from across driveways. But even as the unity grew stronger, a shadow lingered. Behind closed blinds and a firmly locked door, Karen seethed. Her humiliation had been replayed countless times on phones and whispered about over fences. The officer's warning echoed in her mind, not as caution but as fuel. She felt betrayed, ridiculed, and cornered in. Karen was never more dangerous than when she felt cornered. At first, her resistance came in small ways. Anonymous complaints to city code enforcement, notes slipped under doors, typed in all caps, glares from her window when children laughed too loudly near her lawn. But none of it worked. The neighborhood had tasted freedom, and no amount of passive aggression could scare them back into silence. That was when she escalated. One Friday evening, as the smell of burgers once again drifted through the air, the sound of an engine roared down the street. A tow truck, summoned not for an accident but for vengeance, backed up to my driveway. Karen had called in a fraudulent report, claiming my car was abandoned and illegally parked. She stood in her yard with arms crossed, watching with satisfaction as the driver prepared his chains. But what she hadn't counted on was the neighborhood watching too. Within moments, a dozen phones were raised, recording the spectacle. Voices called out, challenging the driver. One neighbor, a lawyer, stepped forward to explain that towing without proper grounds could result in serious legal trouble. Another showed him footage from last week's cookout, where my car had clearly been in use. The driver hesitated, sensing the trap. And then, as if on cue, the police arrived again. This time, they didn't even need explanations. They recognized Karen's pattern. They recognized the faces of the neighbors united against her. And when they questioned the tow truck driver, the truth unraveled quickly. The fraudulent call traced back to Karen's address. For the first time, the officers' patience ran out. They didn't just warn her, they cited her. A formal complaint was filed, with consequences that could no longer be ignored. Her face turned pale as the paper was handed to her. Her voice reduced to sputtering protests that no one believed. The neighborhood erupted not in chaos, but in applause. It wasn't just about me, or the cookouts, or the car. It was about years of her bullying, her threats, her attempts to control everyone around her. For the first time, the law was on the side of the community, and Karen had nowhere left to hide. That night, the block party transformed into something more. It wasn't just food and music, it was a celebration of victory. Plates piled high, laughter echoed, and the air buzzed with a joy that was deeper than before. It wasn't simply about defying Karen. It was about reclaiming peace, about proving that no single person could hold a neighborhood hostage forever. From my grill, I watched it all with a mixture of relief and pride. Karen had tried to crush us with fear, but in the end, she had only made us stronger. Her downfall was empty. The work of one person, it was the collective force of a community that refused to be divided. As the night stretched on, children chased each other with glow sticks. Music carried into the warm air, and the officers who had once been called in as enforcers now stopped by as friends, sharing food and laughter with the very people they had once been summoned to disperse. Karen's house, in contrast, was silent. Her blinds stayed closed, her porch light off. She had retreated fully into her own bitterness, cut off from the very world she had tried to dominate. She wasn't gone, not physically, but her reign of intimidation was over. And that, I realized, was the real ending. Not her screams, not her citations, not even her humiliation, but the silence that followed. A silence that meant the neighborhood had moved on, while she remained trapped in the walls of her own resentment. In the weeks that followed, the stories spread. Clips of her meltdowns circulated online, turning her into a cautionary tale far beyond our cul-de-sac. But for us, the victory wasn't in the viral fame. It was in the laughter that lingered, the friendships that had formed, and the peace that finally returned. Karen had called the cops to break us, but in the end, all she did was bring us together. And that's the story of how one woman's crusade against barbecue backfired so completely that it gave birth to the strongest community our street had ever seen.